Ever get that feeling, when you're scrolling through social media?
Yeah,
Those perfectly filtered lives, the exotic vacations.
right.
It's easy to start comparing and feeling a little, envious.
Oh, absolutely.
But what if those picture-perfect moments are actually masking something much darker?
It's a really interesting question. We often see social media as just this highlight reel, but what is going on behind the scenes?
Okay, now I'm intrigued.
hmm
Where do we even begin to unpack this whole idea?
Well, let's start with a concept from psychology called the dark triad.
Hmm.
It refers to three personality traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy.
Yeah?
And while those terms sound a little intense, it's important to remember they exist on a spectrum.
Yeah.
We're not talking about clinical diagnoses here.
Ugh.
It's just subtle tendencies that can influence behavior.
So how do these dark triad traits play out when it comes to social media?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Research suggests that people high in these traits, particularly vulnerable narcissism,
Hmm.
might be more likely to present a very carefully curated online persona that masks underlying insecurities.
Vulnerable narcissism.
Yeah.
I've heard of narcissism, but what makes it vulnerable?
Think of it as narcissism, but with this layer of fragility underneath.
Okay.
They crave admiration and validation just like other narcissists, but they also struggle with deep feelings of inadequacy and they're very sensitive to criticism.
So they might use social media as a way to project confidence and success, even if that's not how they truly feel on the inside.
Exactly. It's a way to sort of shield themselves from judgment and rejection while seeking external validation to boost their fragile self-esteem.
So it's like building a facade to protect themselves.
Exactly. And
Huh.
social media provides the perfect platform for that. You can carefully control the image you project,
Yeah,
choosing only the most flattering photos, sharing carefully crafted stories,
right.
essentially creating this persona that might be far removed from their true self.
It's like they're living a double life, one online and one offline. And the online version is all about portraying this like idealized, perfect version of themselves.
Yeah, and that's where the potential disconnect comes up.
Yeah.
Well, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to present your best self online.
Yeah.
When it becomes this compulsive need to maintain this flawless facade, it really raises concerns about their well-being.
Because that constant pressure to project perfection can't be healthy.
Right? Not at all.
It's like they're trapped in this cycle of seeking validation and never feeling truly fulfilled.
Exactly. That's where things get tricky. The line between presenting your best self and creating a completely fabricated persona can become blurred.
And how do the other dark triad traits, Machiavellianism and psychopathy, factor into all of this?
Machiavellianism is about manipulation and a focus on personal gain.
Okay.
So you can see how this might manifest online in the way someone uses social media to build a following or influence others,
Right.
or even exploit situations for their own benefit.
So it's more about using social media as a tool to achieve their goals, even if it means, being deceptive or disingenuous.
Right. They might be very calculated in their online interactions, always thinking about how to leverage their persona for personal gain.
And what about psychopathy?
Well, psychopathy at its core is marked by a lack of empathy and remorse, impulsivity, and a tendency towards superficial charm.
Mm-hmm.
Now remember, we're talking about subtle tendencies here, not clinical diagnoses.
Right.
But in the context of social media, someone high in these psychopathic traits might be more likely to engage in risky or attention-seeking behaviors online.
Hmm.
or disregard the feelings of others, or even use social media to manipulate or deceive.
So it's like their online persona becomes this mask for their true nature, allowing them to engage in behaviors they might not be able to get away with in the real world.
That's a possible interpretation, and it raises an important question about anonymity and the lack of accountability that we often see online. It can create this sense of detachment from real world consequences, which might embolden individuals to act in ways they wouldn't otherwise.
This is all starting to make sense now.
Good.
It also raises some ethical concerns
Yeah.
about the potential for manipulation and exploitation on social media,
Yeah.
particularly when influencers have such a large reach and impact on their followers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a conversation for another time, though.
Well, I'm definitely feeling a bit more wary of those picture-perfect lives now.
Yeah.
But before we spiral into complete social media skepticism, I'm curious to explore the specifics of how these dark triad traits actually manifest on different platforms.
Okay.
You mentioned research on Instagram, right?
Yes, there have been some fascinating studies looking at Instagram.
Yeah.
The visual filtered nature of the platform seems to lend itself particularly well to creating these curated personas,
Okay.
especially for those struggling with vulnerable narcissism.
Okay, let's dive into those studies. What exactly did they find?
One study found that individuals high in vulnerable narcissism and Machiavellianism were more likely to have a significant mismatch between their true self and their Instagram self.
So their Instagram feeds were essentially a carefully constructed illusion.
In a sense, yes. And they were using the platform to create this fantasy world where they could escape their insecurities and project this image of perfection that may have been far removed from their reality.
It's almost like they're living a double life, one online and one offline.
Right.
And the online version is all about portraying this, idealized, perfect version of themselves.
Yeah, and that's where the potential disconnect comes up.
Yeah.
While there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to present your best self online,
Yeah.
when it becomes this compulsive need to maintain this flawless facade, it really raises concerns about their well-being.
Because that
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky. The line between presenting your best self and creating a completely fabricated persona can become blurred. And the more someone invests in that online persona, the greater the potential for dissonance between their online and offline lives.
So in a way, social media can become a trap for those struggling with these darker aspects of their personality.
Mm.
It feeds their need for validation while simultaneously fueling their insecurities.
That's a very insightful way to put it. It creates this vicious cycle that can be difficult to escape.
I'm starting to see how this all connects. But if someone is carefully crafting their online image, can we even tell anything about their true personality just by looking at their Instagram profile?
Right.
I mean, can we really separate the facade from the real person behind the screen?
That's a great question, and it leads us to some even more intriguing research that might surprise you.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
You might be surprised to learn that strangers can actually be somewhat accurate in judging personality traits just based on someone's Instagram profile.
Really? That's fascinating and a little bit unnerving. I mean, are we that transparent online? What kind of traits are we talking about?
Researchers found that people could somewhat accurately assess traits like extroversion, openness, narcissism, and even self-esteem just by looking at someone's Instagram.
Oh, that's kind of scary. But what are people picking up on? Is it just like the number of selfies or the things people post about? I feel like I need a crash course in digital body language.
It's more nuanced than that. While those things play a role, it's the overall activity level and the vibe of their posts that seem to be strong indicators. Think about it this way. If you walk into someone's apartment, you get a sense of their personality from the way they've decorated the books. They have the overall atmosphere. Their Instagram is kind of like their digital apartment.
Okay, that analogy makes sense. So it's about looking at the bigger picture, not just focusing on individual posts. But I'm still a little skeptical. If people are trying to project a certain image online, wouldn't that skew the results? Couldn't someone who's actually quite introverted make their profile seem super outgoing and adventurous?
That's a valid point, and it's one of the things that researchers considered. But here's where it gets really interesting. While strangers were somewhat accurate in judging certain traits, the things we often associate with those traits, like frequent self-promotion or appearance-focused posts, weren't actually strongly correlated with having those traits.
Wait, so you're saying that someone who's constantly posting selfies and bragging about their accomplishments might not actually be that narcissistic or self-centered?
The research suggests that's a possibility. It's almost like those outward displays of confidence are a way of overcompensating for inner insecurities. It challenges that assumption that what we see online is always a true reflection of someone's personality.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about social media.
Mhm.
So if those more obvious cues aren't reliable, what should we be paying attention to if we're trying to get a sense of someone's personality online? What are the subtle signs that give away the real person behind the carefully crafted persona?
The study found that the most reliable indicators were the user's overall activity level, how often they post, how much they interact with others, and the general tone and aesthetic of their content. Are their posts colorful and positive? Do they engage in thoughtful discussions or just focus on superficial topics? Those types of things were more telling than the more overt attempts at self-promotion.
So it's about looking beyond the curated facade and paying attention to the details that reveal a more authentic self.
Exactly. It's like being a digital detective searching for clues to uncover the real person behind the profile.
I love that analogy. It makes this whole topic feel less intimidating and more like a fascinating puzzle to solve.
That's a great way to approach it. And it's important to remember that online personas are just one facet of a person's complex identity.
This whole conversation has me thinking about the pressures of being an influencer. They're constantly under scrutiny, expected to maintain this perfect image and engage with their followers 24/7. I can only imagine how exhausting and emotionally draining that must be, especially if they're already struggling with the insecurities we talked about earlier.
It's undoubtedly a demanding lifestyle, and it raises some important questions about the potential psychological impact. Imagine constantly feeling the need to present this idealized version of yourself to the world, knowing that thousands, even millions of people are watching your every move and judging every post. It's bound to take a toll on even the most resilient person.
Especially when you consider the research we discussed earlier about the connection between certain personality traits and problematic internet use. Could influencers, by the very nature of their work, be more vulnerable to developing those kinds of issues?
It's certainly a concern. We know that Machiavellianism and spitefulness traits often associated with a desire for control and manipulation have been linked to problematic internet use. And if influencers are driven by those traits and their job requires them to be constantly online, it's logical to consider the potential risks.
It's almost like a perfect storm. They're driven by these traits that make them susceptible to problematic internet use, and their job constantly feeds those tendencies. It's like being caught in this digital feedback loop that's hard to break free from.
And it's further complicated by the fact that their livelihood depends on maintaining a certain level of engagement and popularity online. It creates this pressure to constantly produce content, chase trends, and stay relevant, which can be incredibly demanding and stressful.
It makes you wonder about the long-term effects on their mental health. Are they sacrificing their well-being for the sake of online fame and fortune? It's a troubling thought.
It certainly raises ethical questions about the responsibility we have as consumers of online content. Are we, in a way, complicit in this system that prioritizes outward appearances over genuine well-being?
That's a heavy question, and one I'm not sure I have the answer to, but it's definitely something to think about. So what can we do? Are we just supposed to accept that social media is inherently problematic and that those who engage with it are at risk?
I don't think it's about accepting it, but rather about promoting awareness and fostering a more critical and compassionate approach to online interactions. We need to recognize that social media is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
So it's about being more mindful of how we use social media and the potential impact it can have on ourselves and others.
Exactly. We need to develop a healthy skepticism, question the motives behind the content we consume, and remember that there's often more to the story than meets the eye. And most importantly, we need to remember that behind every profile is a real person with their own complexities and vulnerabilities.
It's a good reminder that we're all human regardless of how perfect our online personas may appear.
Absolutely. And extending compassion and understanding both to ourselves and others is crucial in navigating the complexities of the digital world.
This conversation has definitely given me a lot to ponder. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on social media and the people who inhabit it. But before we wrap up this fascinating discussion, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we can move forward in a way that promotes both personal well-being and responsible online engagement.
Yeah, it feels like we've uncovered this whole hidden dimension of social media.
Right,
One where the line between reality and these carefully crafted personas, it can be incredibly blurry.
yeah.
But knowing what we know now, how can we use this knowledge to have like a healthier relationship with the online world?
That's the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah.
I think it starts with awareness.
Yeah.
The more we understand about the psychology behind it,
Yeah.
the motivations for these behaviors, and the potential pitfalls, the better equipped we'll be to navigate it in a way that, protects our well-being.
So it's about being more conscious consumers of content,
Exactly.
recognizing that not everything is as it seems, and being more deciding about, who and what we choose to engage with online, right? It's like developing a healthy skepticism, questioning those seemingly perfect lives,
Right.
remembering that everyone, even those with millions of followers, has their own struggles and insecurities.
But is there a risk of becoming overly cynical? I mean, I don't want to start viewing everyone on social media as a potential manipulator,
Right.
or assume that every influencer is secretly miserable.
Yeah, I understand that. It's not about becoming cynical, but it's more about cultivating a balanced perspective.
Okay.
We can appreciate the creativity and the humor and the connections
Right.
that social media offers while also recognizing its potential to distort reality and fuel those unhealthy comparisons.
So how do we strike that balance? It feels like a tightrope walk between, enjoying the benefits of social media without falling into that trap of believing everything we see
Mm-hmm.
and, letting it negatively impact our self-esteem.
One strategy is to be more intentional about our social media use. Are we mindlessly scrolling for hours, or are we engaging with content that truly interests us and aligns with our values? Are we following accounts that inspire and uplift us, or are we exposing ourselves to content that triggers envy and self-doubt?
Those are really great points.
Yeah,
It's about making conscious choices about what we consume
yeah,
and how we allow it to impact our mood and outlook. But it's not just about what we consume, right? It's also about how we present ourselves online.
absolutely. We can all fall into that trap of trying to project a certain image,
Right.
whether it's showcasing our accomplishments or highlighting our best moments or curating a feed that portrays a certain lifestyle. But it's important to ask ourselves why we feel the need to do that.
Yeah.
Are we seeking validation from others, or are we genuinely trying to connect and share our experiences?
It's almost like we need to develop a personal social media philosophy,
Yes.
a set of guidelines that helps us navigate the online world
Yeah.
in a way that feels authentic and healthy and aligned with our values.
I love that idea. A social media philosophy. It's about being mindful of our motivations, setting boundaries, and prioritizing our well-being both online and offline.
This has been such an enlightening conversation.
Mm,
I feel like I'm walking away with a whole new toolkit for navigating, the complexities of social media. But before we sign off, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier.
yeah.
The idea that influencers, because of what they do, might be particularly vulnerable to the negative impacts of social media.
Right.
What advice would you give to someone in that position, someone who's constantly under pressure to project a certain image and maintain a high level of engagement?
I think it's crucial for influencers to prioritize their mental health and establish boundaries between their online and offline lives. Remember that your worth is not determined by your follower count or the number of likes you receive. Cultivate a support system outside of social media. Engage in activities that bring you joy and fulfillment offline. And don't be afraid to take breaks from the digital world when you need to recharge and reconnect with your true self.
That's such important advice, and it really applies to all of us. We need to remember that our online personas are just one small part of who we are.
Yeah. Well said. And on that note, if anyone needs a reminder of the complexities and pressures of modern life, I highly recommend checking out the song Psycho by Puddle of Mud.
That's a perfect musical note to end on. A little bit of angst to help us process all the insights we've gained today. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating exploration of the hidden world of social media. Until next time, stay curious, stay mindful, and stay connected. But don't forget to log off every now and then and reconnect with the real world.